London, 1807 held its breath beneath a sky the color of tarnished silver, as though the heavens themselves conspired to witness Augusta Harrow's undoing. Inside the gilded ballroom of Ravenshire House, where 100 candles flickered like trembling stars, the murmurs had already begun. Guests moved in elegant currents of silk and satin, but their whispered tides were drawn irresistibly toward one quiet figure standing near the marble columns. Augusta's presence was not loud, nor was it presumptuous. Yet tonight, even her silence was treated as an offense. She clasped her gloved hands before her, trying to appear undisturbed, but shame gathered around her like an unwanted mantle. She had not anticipated this cruel shift in the atmosphere. Only hours earlier, she had dressed with the modest hope of passing unnoticed, fulfilling her duties as companion to the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshire with diligence and grace. Augusta Harrow had always known her place, had always regarded the boundaries of class with careful obedience. But obedience meant little when envy, entitlement, and social suspicion sharpened their claws. The moment she crossed the threshold, several ladies turned away, fanning themselves with theatrical indignation, while the men glanced at her with an interest that felt more threatening than flattering. The news had traveled quickly, carried by lips eager for scandal. The young Duke of Ravenshire had been seen speaking to her near the orangery 3 nights ago. Though nothing improper had occurred, nothing but a brief exchange regarding his mother's health, it had been enough to stir the imaginations of London's elite. And imagination, in such circles, was far more dangerous than truth. Now Augusta stood alone, aware that every pair of eyes assessed her as though she had trespassed into a realm never meant for her. She swallowed, willing herself to remain composed, but composure had become a fragile thing. The Duke himself, Edward Ravenshire, stood across the ballroom speaking to Parliament's newest appointee, though his gaze flickered toward Augusta with unmistakable concern. She did not dare return it. Any acknowledgment could deepen the shadow forming around her name. She knew he meant no harm. Edward, despite his rank, had always acted with sincerity. Yet in the rigid world they inhabited, sincerity was a frail shield against rumor. Augusta feared that even his well-intentioned kindness might destroy the life her father's sacrifices had built for her. One misinterpreted moment could unravel years of cautious propriety. The room grew warmer, stifling even, but Augusta could not move without attracting more attention. She fixed her gaze upon a distant tapestry, wishing she could disappear into its embroidered quiet. From the far end of the hall, the Dowager Duchess advanced with slow, deliberate steps, each one echoing like a judicial pronouncement. Her face, an elegant mask of restraint, revealed nothing of the anger Augusta knew simmered beneath. The Duchess had never approved of Augusta's presence, tolerating her only because her references had been impeccable and her demeanor irreproachable. But irreproachability was a flimsy defense against conjecture. When the Duchess stopped before her, the surrounding conversations fell into a hush. Augusta lowered her head in respect, though her heart beat a painful staccato. The Duchess's voice, cool and precise, carried further than decorum required. "Miss Harrow, I believe you are acquainted with the boundaries appropriate to your position." The words were not a question, they were an accusation wrapped in lace. Augusta felt heat rise to her cheeks, yet she forced herself to meet the older woman's gaze with steady civility. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I have never forgotten them." "Then you must refresh your memory," the Duchess replied. Her eyes held no softness, only a glacial certainty. "I will not have whispers circulating about my son and a young woman who serves in my household. It is beneath the dignity of this family." The blow landed with brutal accuracy. Augusta inhaled slowly, fighting the sting behind her eyes. She could endure misconception, but she could not bear being spoken of as though she were a threat merely by existing. "I assure you," Augusta began, "the Duke and I—" "You will not speak his name," the Duchess interrupted, her tone sharpening. A group of ladies listened with barely concealed delight, as though they had paid admission for this spectacle. "You will conduct yourself with discretion, remove yourself from situations where misinterpretations may arise, and remember that your presence here is a privilege, not a right." Each syllable struck Augusta with the precision of a blade honed over years of aristocratic supremacy. She nodded, though the motion cost her. "Yes, Your Grace. I understand." Yet the Duchess was not finished. Leaning closer, she lowered her voice, but not enough to prevent others from hearing. Even if you were the last woman alive, I should never allow my son to marry you. The cruelty was deliberate, calibrated for humiliation. Augusta felt her breath falter, her composure trembling on the brink. The words seemed to echo through the hall, settling heavily upon every listener. For a moment, she stood utterly still, as though any movement might cause her carefully gathered dignity to shatter across the polished floor. Edward took an involuntary step forward, his expression darkening with indignation, but the Duchess cast him a silencing look. Augusta, mustering every fragment of pride she possessed, offered a small curtsy. "Your Grace," she whispered, her voice steady despite the turmoil within, "I shall not be the cause of your discomfort." She turned, intending to retreat from the merciless brightness of the ballroom. But each step felt weighted with the eyes that followed her, dissecting her shame as though it were entertainment. The air beyond the doors felt colder, sharper, yet somehow more forgiving. As she moved down the corridor lined with ancestral portraits, Augusta paused only when she was certain no one could witness the trembling she could finally no longer contain. The Duchess's words echoed brutally in her mind, carving doubts she had never permitted herself to entertain. She pressed a hand to her chest, struggling to steady her breath. She did not fear poverty nor loneliness. She feared the erosion of her character in the eyes of a world eager to condemn her. She feared that even innocence, when misunderstood, could be transformed into guilt. Yet beneath the sting of humiliation, another emotion flickered, one she scarcely dared acknowledge. Edward's expression when he stepped forward, the protective anger in his eyes, the unmistakable ache of someone who wished he could defy every expectation. That moment, fleeting though it was, settled like a seed within her heart. A seed that, even now, in the aftermath of disgrace, refused to wither. Augusta exhaled slowly, gathering her resolve. Shame had marked her tonight, but it had not conquered her. And though she did not know it yet, the night's humiliation was merely the first tremor of a story that would soon shake Ravenshire to its core. Winter settled over Ravenshire like a solemn decree, cloaking the estate in white silence that seemed to amplify every whisper spoken within its walls. In the weeks following the humiliating scene at the ballroom, Augusta Harrow carried herself with a composure more deliberate than ever before. Yet no composure, however carefully curated, could shield her from the spreading murmurs that had taken root in London and begun their slow crawl into the countryside. She felt them even when no one spoke them aloud, felt the suspicion lingering in the glances of visiting ladies, heard the echo of their condemnation in the clipped patience of the household servants. The world she had once moved through with modest but genuine contentment now regarded her with a cold curiosity that pierced more deeply than contempt. Even so, Augusta fulfilled her duties with unwavering discipline. She arranged the Dowager Duchess's correspondence, oversaw the repair of a torn lace cuff, organized the Duchess's invitations, and walked beside her during afternoon promenades. Yet beneath every task lay a fragile tension, for the Duchess's eyes, sharp as frost, never left her for long. Augusta could not determine whether the Duchess watched her to detect impropriety or simply to remind her that forgiveness was not on the horizon. But Augusta endured the scrutiny, reminding herself that dignity was not something others could grant or revoke. It was during one such morning promenade, beneath a pale sun struggling to break through the winter clouds, that Augusta's world shifted again. As she adjusted the Duchess's cloak and prepared to follow her along the frosted garden path, a footman approached with a hesitant bow. "For Miss Harrow," he murmured, extending a small envelope sealed with dark green wax. Augusta blinked in confusion. No one wrote to her here. The Duchess shot the footman a look so chilling he stepped back at once, leaving Augusta standing with the envelope feeling as if she held a live ember. She turned it over cautiously. There was no signature, only a small pressed sprig of winter jasmine beneath the seal. Her breath caught. Only one person in Ravenshire marked his notes with jasmine. The Duke. She hesitated, aware that the Duchess's gaze bore into her, but withdrew the letter before suspicion could deepen. She waited until she had returned to her small chamber before breaking the seal. The note inside was brief, written in the Duke's unmistakably steady hand. "For courage undeservedly tested. J." Folded with it was a delicate silver button, one missing from the Duke's riding coat, a detail she recognized instantly. Her fingers trembled, not because the token was romantic. There was nothing overtly improper about a silver button, but because it was undeniably personal. He should not have sent it. and she should not have felt the warmth that unfurled in her chest upon receiving it. She tucked the note away, knowing she must return the token and beg him to show more caution. Yet she could not bring herself to discard the silver button. She placed it inside her prayer book, where sentiment and secrecy might coexist without betrayal. The scandal that followed arrived more quickly than she feared. 2 days later, during breakfast in the Duchess's private dining room, Lady Weatherly, an old friend of the Duchess and an unrepentant collector of gossip, leaned forward with a conspiratorial gleam. "My dear," she said to the Duchess, "I could not help noticing that your son seems rather preoccupied of late. One might almost think he has sentimental inclinations toward someone." Her voice carried enough volume to reach Augusta, who lowered her gaze to her teacup, praying the ground would swallow her whole. The Duchess stiffened. "My son's inclinations," she replied, "are none of society's concern." Lady Weatherly only smiled, a viper pleased with its own venom. "Of course, but when one hears that he has been gifting tokens, well, speculation becomes inevitable." Augusta's cup nearly slipped from her hands. She forced her grip to tighten, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The Duchess's gaze snapped to her, sharp as a drawn blade. "Tokens," she repeated. "To whom would he give tokens?" The room felt suddenly too small. Augusta's lungs seemed incapable of drawing air. She did not know how this gossip had begun, nor who had seen the envelope delivered, but she understood instantly that silence would be mistaken for guilt. She looked up slowly, choosing what dignity she could salvage. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "the Duke sent me a note. It was not a token of affection, only a gesture of kindness. But I should have returned it at once. I intend to." Lady Weatherly gasped with exaggerated delight. "So it is true." The Duchess rose so abruptly her chair scraped against the polished floor. "You will return it," she said, "and you will not encourage him further. I will not tolerate impropriety under my roof." Augusta bowed her head, though humiliation burned through her like fever. "I understand." But understanding did not make the situation easier. When she sought out the Duke that afternoon, intending to return the note, she found him in the stables adjusting the bridle of his chestnut mare. He looked up when she approached, and the brief softness that crossed his features nearly unraveled her. "Miss Harrow," he said gently, as though speaking her name brought him relief. "I hoped you might come." She forced her hands to remain steady as she withdrew the folded paper. "Your Grace, I must return this. I should not have accepted it. Your mother—" "My mother's opinion," he interrupted, "need not govern every breath taken in this household." He stepped closer, his voice low enough to be stolen by the wind. "If I have made your position more difficult, Augusta, then I am sincerely sorry." Her heart lurched painfully at the sincerity in his tone. "You meant no harm," she whispered. "But harm has found us regardless." He studied her, his expression marked by frustration and something deeper, something she dared not name. "I only wished to offer comfort." "And comfort," she replied, "is the one thing I cannot accept from you." A long silence stretched between them, filled with the soft snorts of the horses and the distant rustling of barren branches. Finally, she placed the note in his hand, her fingers brushing his briefly before withdrawing. The touch lingered in the air like a secret. She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Augusta," he said quietly, "I will not allow this winter to ruin you." She did not turn back. "It already has, Your Grace," she murmured. "But I will endure it." The words carried a finality she had not intended, but they settled between them like falling snow, quiet, inevitable, and impossible to sweep away. And though she walked from the stables with her head held high, the weight of the Duke's silent promise followed her through the barren gardens and back into the house where whispers had already begun to gather like storm clouds. Night descended upon Ravenshire in a hush so complete it seemed the great estate held its breath. Winter's grip had tightened, icing the windows with delicate frostwork and muffling the world beneath a heavy quilt of snow. Within the manor's ancient stone walls, a different silence lingered, one born not of peace, but of dread. For 3 days now, the Duke of Ravenshire had been confined to his bed, his strength sapped by a sudden fever that struck without warning and worsened with merciless speed. Servants whispered that he had collapsed during a morning ride, his horse returning to the stables riderless, reins trailing like abandoned ribbons. The Dowager Duchess, usually the embodiment of imperious composure, now paced the corridor outside his chamber with an agitation that startled even her most seasoned attendants. Augusta Harrow, though dismissed from the Duchess's service after the scandalous incident in the stable-yard, had not yet departed Ravenshire. The snow had rendered travel nearly impossible. Each hour trapped within the estate brought a new onslaught of uneasy rumors. Some said the Duke's fever had turned violent, that he cried out without sense. Others whispered that he refused all nourishment, as though his body had already surrendered. Augusta tried to dismiss the talk, but dread seeped into her with each passing minute, saturating her thoughts with terror she had no right to feel. That evening, as she stood in the dim corridor outside the modest guest chamber where she had been placed, she heard hurried footsteps. Lord Whitcomb, the Duke's trusted adviser, strode past her, his expression grave. She dared to speak. "My lord, is he worsening?" Her voice was barely more than a whisper, yet Whitcomb stopped and looked at her with unexpected clarity. "The fever grips him cruelly," he admitted. "He drifts in and out of consciousness. He knows none of us." Augusta pressed a hand to her throat, fighting the surge of anguish she knew she must conceal. "Is there nothing to be done?" she asked. Whitcomb exhaled, weary and defeated. "We have sent for physicians from London. But," he hesitated, then added in a softened tone, "forgive me, Miss Harrow, but in his delirium, he calls out a name, again and again." Augusta nodded numbly, expecting to hear the name of some distant aunt or childhood nurse. Instead, Whitcomb said, very quietly, "He calls for you." Her breath left her in a silent gasp. The corridor tilted slightly, forcing her to grasp the banister for steadiness. Whitcomb continued, "It is as though your name were the only anchor in his fevered mind." "But why tell me this?" she managed, her voice trembling. "I cannot go to him. The Duchess would prefer propriety over mercy," he completed. "But I have known Edward since he was a boy. I know the significance of a man's instinct when his guard is gone." He met her gaze with earnest gravity. "Sometimes the truth we hide emerges only when our strength fails." Before she could reply, the Duchess herself appeared at the far end of the corridor. Her face was pale, the rigid dignity she wore like armor now marred by unmistakable fear. "Miss Harrow," she called sharply, "I require a word with you." Augusta followed her down the hall, her steps unsteady. The Duchess stopped before the Duke's chamber door but did not open it. Instead, she turned, her expression a tumult of conflict and maternal desperation. "My son," she said, and her voice trembled for the first time Augusta had ever heard, "is in a perilous state. He calls your name with such intensity that I can no longer pretend ignorance of what lies in his heart." Augusta lowered her gaze. "I never sought his affection, your grace." "I know," the Duchess whispered. "That is what makes this all the more infuriating." She closed her eyes briefly, gathering herself. "I do not approve of you, Miss Harrow. But tonight, my disapproval is irrelevant. He refuses medicine unless he hears your voice. He refuses to sleep unless he believes you are near." Augusta felt her heart twist painfully. "What would you have me do?" she asked softly. The Duchess swallowed. "Stand beside his bed. Speak to him. Nothing more. Permission. Unthinkable, impossible, and yet undeniably real." The Duchess opened the door. Augusta stepped inside. The chamber was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of fever and the damp cloths draped over the Duke's forehead. Edward lay in the center of the great bed, his usually sharp features drawn and pale, his hair damp with perspiration. His chest rose and fell unevenly, each breath a fragile negotiation between life and some darker pull. Augusta approached slowly, fearful her presence might disturb him further. But even before she reached the bedside, he stirred. "Augusta!" The single word, frail yet fervent, escaped his lips with unmistakable yearning. Augusta's throat tightened. She took the hand that lay limp atop the sheets. His skin burned. "I am here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Rest now." His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment he seemed to recognize her. Tears pricked her eyes. She sat, her fingers curled gently around his, her presence the lifeline he clung to. "You must take your medicine," she murmured. "Please." He shook his head weakly. "Don't go." The plea was so raw it pierced her. "I will not," she answered. Several minutes passed. She coaxed him through sips of the physician's tonic, her voice soft and steady. Each word she spoke soothed him, easing the violent tremors that had tormented him only hours before. The Duchess, standing silently in the shadows, watched with something like awe. When the Duke's breathing steadied, Augusta leaned closer, brushing a damp strand of hair from his brow. "You must not frighten the household so," she whispered, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability in the privacy of his delirium. "We depend on your strength." His eyes opened halfway. "I depend on you," he murmured, barely a breath, but unmistakably sincere. Augusta froze, tears shimmering unshed. Before she could respond, he drifted into a deeper, calmer sleep, still holding her hand as though it were the only thing tethering him to the world. She remained beside him long after exhaustion should have claimed her. When she finally looked up, the Duchess was watching. But there was no anger in her gaze now, only realization, and perhaps, very faintly, surrender. Augusta lowered her eyes, uncertain what tomorrow would bring, but sure of one thing: the Duke's confession, uttered in fever yet carved in truth, had altered the course of all their lives. And the night was not yet done shaping what would follow. Snow lay thick across the grounds of Ravenshire Manor as dawn crept slowly over the horizon, painting the frosted gardens in muted shades of gold. Augusta Harrow stood near the tall windows of the east corridor, her breath trembling against the glass as she watched servants carry steaming water toward the Duke's chamber. For the first time in many sleepless nights, the house stirred with something other than dread. Rumor whispered that the Duke had opened his eyes just before sunrise. It was enough to steady her shaking hands, though not enough to calm her racing thoughts. She had spent the last week living between fear and helplessness, her heart caught between duty and love she dared not name aloud. Every step taken within Ravenshire felt like trespass, yet every whisper of his suffering felt like a summons she could not resist. Lady Ravenshire's footsteps echoed down the corridor before Augusta even turned. The Duchess Dowager moved with her usual rigid grace, though there was a tension in her expression that betrayed a night of long anxieties. Her gaze fell on Augusta with the same frost that had marked their first meeting, yet something uncertain flickered beneath it. Augusta clasped her hands in front of her and lowered her eyes, determined not to provoke further hostility. She had been summoned, after all, though the reason remained unspoken. For all Augusta knew, this might be the moment she was asked to leave Ravenshire forever. The Duchess came to a halt just a few feet away. "He asked for you again," she said, her voice sharp even in its restraint. 3 times before dawn. Augusta swallowed hard. Hearing it from the Duchess's own lips felt impossible, almost cruel. The very woman who had once vowed that even if Augusta were the last woman alive, she would never allow her son to marry her now stood before her carrying words soaked in reluctant truth. Augusta bowed her head. "If His Grace requires comfort, I am ready to serve in any way that does not offend propriety." The Duchess's jaw tightened, as though offended by Augusta's humility or perhaps unsettled by it. "You mistake me. I am not asking you to serve. I am telling you what he asked for. What he," her breath caught, "what he cried out for." The silence that followed stretched too long, heavy with the weight of things neither woman wished to acknowledge. At last the Duchess turned away, staring out the window as Augusta had done moments before. "I do not understand my son," she said quietly, her voice no longer cold but tired. "He was raised to value strength, discipline, alliances that protect our name. Yet in his desperation he calls for you, a woman who brings no advantage to Ravenshire." Augusta felt the familiar sting of inadequacy but forced herself to answer with composure. "I bring him nothing but honesty and concern for his well-being. If that is a flaw, I cannot mend it." The Duchess exhaled, and for the first time, Augusta sensed a fracture in the woman's unyielding armor. "No," Lady Ravenshire murmured. "Perhaps it is I who should mend something." Before Augusta could respond, the older woman stepped back. He is awake now. Go to him. Augusta's heart lurched. Permission, unexpected, fragile, and full of unspoken questions, had been granted. She crossed the corridor with careful steps, unsure whether to trust this shift or brace for its sudden reversal. But when she reached the great oak door of the Duke's chamber, all hesitation vanished. She knocked lightly, received no answer, then pushed the door open. The room was dim, warmed by a low fire and heavy curtains that blocked the glare of morning. The Duke lay propped against pillows, his face pale but no longer as deathly still as the night before. His eyes fluttered open at the sound of her entrance, and a slow, unmistakable recognition softened his features. "Augusta," he whispered, her name breaking apart like a prayer spoken through days of suffering. She rushed to his side, but not too quickly, lest she betray the overwhelming relief flooding her. "You should not speak," she murmured. "Rest is what you need." His hand reached weakly toward her, and without hesitation she took it, the warmth of his skin sparking a fierce ache in her chest. "You came," he breathed. "I knew you would." She blinked hard to keep tears from falling. "How could I stay away?" His fingers tightened just slightly around hers, a fragile but deliberate gesture. "Every night," he said, closing his eyes as if the memory exhausted him, "I thought I was losing myself, slipping away from everything I was supposed to be. But the only thing I could hold on to was you. Your voice, your kindness, the way you never turn from me even when others do." Augusta's breath caught. These confessions were too raw, too intimate, and yet too precious to silence. "You must focus on recovering," she said softly. "Feelings can be tangled by illness." But he shook his head, weak though the movement was. "Illness strips away everything false. What remains is truth." She could not argue. She could only sit beside him, silently praying he would not mistake gratitude or delirium for devotion. But when he opened his eyes again, there was clarity there, clarity and something else she dared not claim. The door creaked, breaking the fragile bubble between them. Lady Ravenshire entered quietly, her gaze shifting between her son's pale face and Augusta's hand still held within his. For once, the Duchess did not scold or glare. Instead she stepped closer, folding her hands before her. "Nicholas," she said gently, "you frightened us." The Duke offered a faint smile. "Mother, I'm not finished yet, not with my life, nor with other matters." His glance drifted to Augusta, and the Duchess followed it. Augusta braced herself for a reprimand, but none came. Instead, Lady Ravenshire drew a slow breath, then spoke with a gravity that made Augusta's heart hammer. "If my son's heart is set," she began, each word chosen with care, "and if his life hangs so delicately that even the smallest comfort can steady him, then I cannot, in good conscience, deny him that comfort." Augusta stared, hardly believing what she heard. Nicholas squeezed her hand, his eyes brightening with a fragile hope. The Duchess looked at her fully for the first time, her expression neither warm nor hostile, but accepting. "Stay," she said simply. "For him." The fire crackled softly, filling the silence that followed with gentle warmth. Augusta felt something within her shift, something long pressed down, now rising with tentative promise. Nicholas's grip around her hand grew steadier, his breathing calmer, as though her presence alone restored strength he had thought lost. And though Augusta had no certainty about what the coming days would bring, one truth rooted itself firmly in her heart. The walls of Ravenshire were no longer closing in on her. They were beginning to open. And somewhere beyond the window, the winter wind softened, the first quiet sign of a long-awaited thaw.